to New Zealand. And I think that if you allow for one person, it does open the floodgates. And I hate myself saying this, but it does really open up floodgates if you allow one in. And so I have to go the other way. Sorry, Mojo.
Even if this family did have their eyes wide open when they came, as you say, and if they knew in advance that their daughter might not be granted a visa, does that matter so much to you? Obviously not so much, Barry.
Oh, to me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is they wouldn't have been allowed in, would they have?
As a complete family unit.
Yeah.
James, what's your view of this?
Well, I mean, look, I'm definitely with. I mean, I don't want to say I'm with the blind girl because it sounds far too emotional, but it's very. I think Mojo has hit the nail on the head in terms of we need to find a way to be a society where we're not evicting 5-year-old blind girls from the country. I hear completely Barry's point. It is a very actual valid point, but I do think we've got to start somewhere. So let's try and find a way to keep the blind 5-year-old child in the country with the family.
Barry, would it be a better criterion that you assess the family as a whole and its likely contribution to the dynamism of New Zealand and New Zealand life? Because previous determinations have considered the effect of repatriating on other family members already in this country. Would you support that sort of assessment?
Oh, totally. And I mean, I might be sounding really hard-lined, and I'm not meaning to be like that. I mean, all I'm saying is that if we had open Slava, everybody from around the world would come, and our health systems would be in major problems. Now, all I'm saying is that I think that this family actually filled out a wrong form, didn't they? Or didn't they say everything's fine when they were filling out the forms? Because there are forms that say, do you have health problems? And if we allow one in, then everybody can come in. And I hate myself for saying it like that, but I think I'm being practical for the country.
Yeah, you have the advantage of me actually over the form filling. I don't know about that. Here's something else I can ask you before we go. The accusations regarding high immigration have included, as the country's talked about Andrew Little's plans, talk of a lack of design, a lack of planning, no clear enunciation of what our targets are here demographically, and this got listeners going. We do need intelligent, informed discussion about New Zealand's need to increase our population, not the emotional talk that avoids intelligent discussion and plans. How big, please? How many people do we want in New Zealand? Should we know that? What do you think?
We've got room for a heck of a lot more, and we've got room in the provincial areas. The room that we don't seem to have is in Auckland, and that seems to be the problem that affects everything. But if I look down here in the South Island, plenty of room. Love to welcome a whole lot of people down here.
I can recommend the South Island. They're good people. It's a good
Thank
place.
you.
It's lovely, especially in winter.
Yes.
So would you
No,
go
it's a
back?
cold one today.
Would you go back to the days and the policies which were once adopted to make sure that they go to the, not just encourage them, but actually tell them to go to Dunedin and Invercargill?
Well,
and
is it a case of telling them, or is it a case of investing
And
in
showing how good it is.
Yes.
Very good. The carrot, not the stick.
Indeed.
Barry Corbett, thank you very much
But
on the
they've got to
panel
be-
today.
They've got to be healthy.
Yeah, I think we heard you on that one.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. And James Nokise, thank you, James.
Thanks very much, mate.
We are back tomorrow with the panel. Thank you, everybody. And Checkpoint is coming up with Rowan Quinn today.
Kia ora, haere mai, welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Rowan Quinn. Tonight we hear an extraordinary tale of escape from a couple who lived on the 18th floor of London's Grenfell Tower block. They say the fire service told them just days before the blaze that they should stay in their flats if a fire broke out because the fire doors would withstand the heat. And we talked to others in their neighbourhood about how the community is working together in the aftermath. We've got more on the UNICEF report card that puts New Zealand bottom of the class when it comes to looking after our kids. Plus, tales of children being served mouldy bread at some Auckland daycare centres. Winston Peters says Susan Devoy's got a cheek telling politicians to keep racism out of election campaigns. All that after the news.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. A scathing new report says New Zealand has the highest rate of youth suicide in the developed world. The report from UNICEF looked at 41 countries in the European Union and the OECD. At 15.6 per 100,000 people aged 15 to 19, New Zealand's rate is twice as bad as the American youth suicide rate and almost 5 times Britain's rate. The chief executive of the Mental Health Foundation, John Robinson, says this is not good enough.
It makes me angry and it makes me very sad and frustrated because this is an avoidable situation, but sadly it's been the reality for far too long and we're simply not getting to grips with preventing suicides amongst our young people.
John Robinson says there needs to be targets for suicide reduction as there are for the road toll and mechanisms like ways of responding to suicide clusters. The New Zealand First Leader has criticised the Race Relations Commissioner for trying to tell him and other politicians how to handle racism. Dame Susan Devoy is urging politicians not to play the race card during this year's election campaign, following the launch of a new anti-racism campaign today. Winston Peters says when someone racially slurred him in January, Dame Susan's office didn't want to know about it.
Look, earlier in the year, another pretend politician called me a house nigger. She did nothing about that, nor did her office. So frankly, I'm not interested in what Susan Devoy's got to say on these matters.
Winston Peters says he doesn't think racism will be a part of this year's election campaign. Survivors of the London Tower inferno say when they raised fears over the single escape route, they were fobbed off by the council's managers. Residents say they also raised worries about the placement of boilers and gas pipes and the absence of a fire alarm or sprinkler system. A community spokesperson, Pilgrim Tucker, says residents were very concerned over the quality of a recent refurbishment of the building.
These residents asked again and again and again. They were threatened with legal action when they said that they wanted this work to take place. You know, and you've got a cost-cutting council that isn't listening to its residents. It's a privatised organisation. And you've got a big building company, Ryden, that is getting a lot of money from a lot of contracts across London and doing shoddy work.
Pilgrim Tucker says residents were unable to take the council to court as they couldn't afford the legal costs. The confirmed death toll remains at 12, but is expected to rise with many people still unaccounted for. The Finance Minister Stephen Joyce says the latest OECD assessment of New Zealand's economy is useful, but the government will not be changing its approach. In its latest 2-yearly review, the Paris-based organisation says this country's economy is growing robustly, but the government could do more to lift low incomes and wealth. It also warns New Zealand's consistently low productivity risks stunting living standards. Stephen Joyce says the government is working on raising productivity, but it's not a quick fix.
It has to be a longer-term story, and it's not on its own. So if you look at the things that the OECD are talking about in terms of encouraging us, the areas where there is a significant change underway, but this is not a 5-minute solution.
The Finance Minister, Stephen Joyce. The Hauraki Collective says members of a Tauranga iwi who've been out on the harbour protesting its settlement have known about the deal for years. Ngaitarangi descendants blocked the port exit today because Hauraki Collective has been given some control in the city as part of a pending treaty settlement. 7 boats, including a carved waka, and about 42 people were out on the water stopping ships from leaving Tauranga's port. Hauraki Collective leader Paul Madgery says Tauranga Moana knew about the deal in 2014 and agreed to the redress.
What appears to have occurred is that some of the current leadership and folk involved don't like what's happened previously, and that is surprising given their close involvement with it. The other key fact in this is that customer interests of Pari Hauraki within Tauranga Moana have been recognised by the Waitangi Tribunal in their reports.
Paul Madgery. The Treaty Negotiations Minister Chris Finlayson says he's been working with Ngaitarangi and he's unimpressed by their protest action. A 29-year-old Brazilian woman has been jailed for 8 years for trying to smuggle nearly 5 kilograms of cocaine in her luggage. Evelyn Stemposki arrived at Auckland Airport on a flight from Brazil via Chile in April. The Auckland police are looking for a woman in what's thought to be an abduction in Newmarket. They say a man forced her into his car after pulling into a bus stop on Broadway near Manukau Road about 7:10 on Tuesday morning. The police say it's likely the two knew each other. It's 5:05. To sport, and the British and Irish Lions coach Warren Gatlin says he wants to keep the All Blacks guessing after naming his team for Saturday's match with the Māori All Blacks in Rotorua. Many are expecting the Lions' top test side to be picked, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Gatlin has named an entirely different starting 15 from the team that lost to the Highlanders and has gone with the loose trio that started against the Crusaders, meaning tour captain Sam Warburton is on the bench. First choice first five, Owen Farrell is also in the reserves. Gatlin says he wants to keep a few tricks up his sleeve.
Even though it's a strong side, we've got to make sure we're not fully showing our hand. We're keeping some combinations back, and we need to keep the All Blacks guessing a little bit about what the final squad may be.
Warren Gatland. Meanwhile, new All Blacks captain Ben Smith says he was surprised by his promotion. Smith replaces Kieran Reid, who's still recovering from thumb surgery, for tomorrow night's test against Samoa at Eden Park. The Highlanders fullback, who has captained in the later stages of All Black games before, says to officially be named captain is an honour.
Yeah, pretty exciting. Looking forward to the challenge tomorrow night, and yeah, it's been a good week, and I'm just excited about doing that role, and leading the team out tomorrow night is going to be a massive honour for myself and my family. Yeah.
Ben Smith. That's the news.
Another shooting in the United States.
Nobody else had a weapon, so he was just killing everyone.
Politicians in the crosshairs.
Steve Scalise, a member of House leadership, was shot and badly wounded.
And gun control arguments in New Zealand.
The issue of stolen firearms is a major problem and part of what needs to be addressed.
In the Line of Fire, Morning Report with Susie Ferguson and Guy and Espinel, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, a big shake-up for the capital's bus fleet. Who's going to benefit? And after 10, Australian chemist and writer Gail Bell on investigating her family's big secret, her grandfather's poisoning of 2 sons. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Manawatu, including Coromandel and the central high country, mostly cloudy with isolated showers in the west. Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mainly fine but isolated showers about coastal Gisborne and Mahia Peninsula later tomorrow. Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast and Wellington, Wairarapa, also Nelson and Marlborough, fine with high cloud. Bulla and Westland, rain spreading north this evening, followed by a few showers. Showers clearing tomorrow and fine spells increasing. Fiordland, rain clearing this evening, cloudy periods and a few showers tomorrow. Canterbury, cloud increasing this evening and the odd shower developing, becoming fine tomorrow morning. Otago and Southland, a period of evening rain followed by a few coastal showers, mainly about Stewart Island. And the Chatham Islands, occasional showers. It's 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
And we begin tonight in London, where an investigation's underway and the death toll is expected to rise after fire engulfed a 24-storey apartment block in North Kensington yesterday. At least 12 people are dead, 68 are in hospital, but a large number, possibly even hundreds, remain unaccounted for following the fire, which is still smouldering more than 24 hours on. And tonight, a couple who escaped from the 18th floor reveal the building was visited by fire crews only last Saturday. The couple says if they'd heeded building protocol from both the fire brigade and building managers to stay in their apartments, they wouldn't be alive today. Bridget Burke reports.
The light of day revealing the stark reality of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Window after window of twisted metal and black. Inside the blackened shell, once home to more than 600 residents, pockets of fire could be seen as the building continued to smoulder. Outside, hours after the fire, plumes of black and grey smoke continued to billow into the sky.
On a scale of 1 to 10, it was an 11. It was an inferno. It was like something out of a film. All bits were flying off of the flats, all the plastic cladding was coming off. I was looking up and I could see little kids at the windows banging, screaming, flashing lights. So it was like something out of a horror movie.
It is not known just how many residents like Mickey got out or how many may have perished there.
Well, it's completely gutted, burnt out, the whole block is. The whole block is. About 1:30 this morning, I was dozing off, I was going to sleep. My girlfriend was fast asleep, the little girl was fast asleep next door. And just as I was dozing off, I smelled plastic. So I thought, hang about, there's a Kindle next door, so I thought it might have been that, but it's overheating. So I've jumped up, turned all the plugs off, there's nothing going on. So I've gone into the kitchen, had a fag because I'd woken up now. I've opened the window up, and I could hear someone shouting, it's getting bigger, but I couldn't see nothing. But I could smell the smoke getting even worse. So I've gone to the front door, I've looked through the spy hole, and there was just smoke everywhere. I've opened the door up to go out into the hallway, and all the neighbours were screaming. And fire alarm was going off, but it was very low. It weren't going to wake no one up. You know, like, if anyone was in a deep sleep, there's nobody going to wake up.
And what about the state of your flat?
I haven't been back up there yet, but from the outside, you can say that it was burnt right throughout everything we own in there's gone. You know, everything. You can see from Latimer Road when you look up, you can see our flat is gone.
There were 120 one- and two-bedroom flats in the 24-storey block. Many surviving residents say the recently refurbished building in North Kensington had no sprinklers, and if there were fire alarms, they didn't hear them. Francis's cousin lived in the building with her son. At the height of the fire, she called him to ask for help.
She was actually saying, "Are you guys coming? Are you guys coming? Are you guys coming?" I was like, yeah, we're coming, because when we went to get the shield from the police van, I thought, yeah, they're going up there to get them down.
But Francis doesn't know if his cousin or the toddler made it out.
And she was saying, "Jeremiah, it's not breathing, it's not breathing." I'm like, okay, give him the kiss of life, give him the kiss of life, you know, and just try to kiss his, blow breath in him, and then compress his chest, so, you know, so he can breathe. And can you imagine the mother and son, you seeing your son like that? You know, it's very painful, very painful.
The Grenfell Action Group Residents Association says it had raised multiple concerns in the past about the risk of fire in the building and its exterior cladding, but these concerns fell on deaf ears.
I've only lived there for less than a year, so I moved in July, and this was one of my main concerns about living in a tower block. On Saturday we did have the fire brigade team come around and speak to people in their houses.
Check alarms to make sure they're working.
Just this Saturday?
Just this Saturday.
Seriously?
Yes.
Yeah, and they told us the protocol was to close your door because the fire door will withstand the heat for a duration of time. But I think what's happened is they're not understanding that this fire has spread all around the building, so that is wrong information for that building and the material in that building, because if you're staying in your house, you could still be trapped.
More than 250 firefighters fought the fire at its peak, but had difficulty reaching people trapped above the 20th floor. The London Fire Brigade's Director of Safety and Assurance, Steve Apter, said his crew's attempts to go higher were hampered by a fractured gas main.
That obviously, as you can imagine, created quite significant hazard. Once that was isolated, the crews were able to progress. Conditions in the tower, and you can see for yourselves, the fire's been burning for some time. The integrity of the building is a significant issue for us as a hazard. But I can confirm crews did make it to the top floor.
Investigations have begun into the cause of the fire, how it spread so rapidly, and why residents were told to stay inside their apartments in the event of a fire. Council leader Nick Paget-Brown vowed the investigation would be thorough.
It is perfectly true that Grenfell Tower underwent a major refurbishment programme starting about 2.5 years ago to improve the hot water system, to improve the heating, to improve insulation, put in new windows, new external cladding, to improve the quality of life for people who were living there. Now, clearly when you do that, there are difficulties, problems, complaints, logistics to resolve, and it is undoubtedly the case that the council received some complaints about the way the work was being conducted. But we will need to look much more closely at how much of that corresponds to the cause of today's fire.
British Prime Minister Theresa May said hundreds of people had lost their homes and she expected the death toll to rise significantly.
Of course, once the scene is secure, once the recovery is complete, then an investigation will take place into the cause of the fire and if there are any lessons to be learned. But until then, our focus must be on ensuring that the emergency services have what they need to continue with their harrowing work, and that help and support is being provided to all those who have suffered as a result of this tragedy.
As the fire service used drones to create access to difficult parts of the building's charred shell, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said authorities would need to take responsibility.
I believe we need to ask questions about what facilities and resources have been given to every local authority that has tower blocks within the area, and frankly, most do. We need to deal with this. We need people to be safe living in high-rise buildings.
Out of the tragedy have come stories of kindness, with Londoners opening their homes to surviving residents and others spending the night in local churches. Many have lost everything, escaping with just the clothes they were wearing. Volunteers Abigail Williams and Cassie Pearce said they were stunned at the numbers of people turning up with donations of food, clothing and water.
The response is unbelievable. I mean, the church was filled with donations almost by 10 o'clock.
On the other side, all the donation points are closed off because everyone's had so much stuff. I know people are doing massive Amazon Prime deliveries as well.
Yeah, and the shock, I don't know, it's just I haven't really thought about it. Yeah, it's kind of...
It can happen anywhere, but shouldn't happen anywhere.
The death toll remains at 12, but is expected to rise significantly in the coming hours. 68 patients are being treated in 6 hospitals. 18 of them are critical. For Checkpoint, Bridget Burke.
Well, Omar Salha witnessed the fire, and in the aftermath he's helped rally volunteers to provide humanitarian relief and donations. He says his neighbourhood in London looks like a refugee camp. He's described the scene there a day after.
There are still fumes coming out of the tower block, and you can still smell the ashes within a mile away from the tower block. And there is a lot of asbestos in the area now. There's been a lot of health hazards being issued. But I mean, one of the toughest things I had to watch was hearing the screams of children from the tower block shouting help. And that for me was extraordinary. I could not really, it was very, very emotional, and a lot of people have truly been affected by that. And it just made me think, imagine if that was a child that I had, or a younger sibling who was shouting from the 17th floor, just asking for help, shouting for help, yet they're not allowed to leave their flat because there is fire above them and there's fire below them. What do you do in that scenario? And it's just extremely tough to fathom and to think about again, and to try and, those images are very vivid, but there always needs to be a reaction, and the reaction we saw today was truly humbling, to see people coming out in their numbers to try and actually affect positive social change.
Do you get a sense that there may be people who could never be found?
That is a possibility. There are still people who are, have 4 or 5 family members who are still missing. There have been a lot of cases of missing persons issued by the Metropolitan Police, and there have been a lot of messages being sent around, asking for help, asking for any advice or information about people who have gone missing. It's going to be very, very difficult, very, very difficult. And I think families are beginning to realize that the longer the days come now, they're accepting the possibility that they will not be able to find their loved ones.
Among all the terrible trauma that people must be suffering today, both those directly affected and those, close by in the community, are people asking questions? How could this happen?
I think they're beginning to ask those questions. I think we'll probably have more strong evidence behind these questions, and hopefully we'll begin to hear more answers in the coming days. But I think right now the most important thing is obviously the 400 to 600 people who have been displaced from this tower block have literally nothing. And I think this is the pertinent issue at hand right now, is that you have people who have literally left the tower block with barefoot on the streets with a mobile phone in their hand, and most of them are wearing their pajamas, and they actually haven't got any other clothes. So they've literally have lost absolutely everything. They have no access to their flats. Everything is burnt down, And it's incredible to think that if we were put in that position, to think that from literally in a space of 24 hours to have everything that you own, to absolutely have nothing, that the most obvious question being asked now is who can help and how can we rehouse these people, and of course later on the line, someone must be accountable. Someone must be held accountable. The local authorities need to look at this very, very closely and understand that there was actually a warning, a risk of a fire hazard warning issued about 9 months ago by the local authority, which has, what many are suggesting, has went unnoticed. And I think these answers, the lack of these answers will raise a lot of questions in the coming days.
And that's Omar Salah there from London. Meanwhile, fire and housing experts here are reassuring the public that New Zealand high-rises are safe, with strict safety guidelines making the chance of a similar fire remote. The London apartment tower's cladding, aluminium composite material, has been used extensively throughout New Zealand, but the experts play down the risk of a disaster happening here. Logan Church reports.
New Zealand fire safety engineer Michael James says the London fire was likely worsened by several factors, including no working smoke alarms, a lack of smoke ventilation and no sprinklers. He says this sort of calamity is unlikely to take place in New Zealand.
We probably wouldn't get all of those things together. Typically in New Zealand we would have a sprinkler system in a building of that size. I don't think that I can recall any of that size that wouldn't have a sprinkler system in.
But Michael James says New Zealand buildings do use the cladding, an aluminium composite material, which is likely to have caused the rapid spread of the tower block fire in London. He says it's made up of insulation wedged between two pieces of aluminium.
It is quite combustible. It's certainly been sold in New Zealand and put on buildings. Up until the beginning of this year, you could have a building up to 25 metres tall where you could install that on.
The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment investigated aluminium composite 3 years ago after a high-rise in Melbourne clad with the material caught fire. The report, released last year, found that aluminium composite panels are combustible and will spread a fire quickly. But the Auckland Property Investors Association President, Andrew Bruce, says there are several measures in place to reduce the risk.
Each individual apartment should be its own individual fire cell. It should take a certain length of time before the fire can transfer between apartments. There's always supposed to be two forms of egress, and buildings actually have warrant fitnesses, and then they have to have regular checks.
The Building Industry Federation Chief Executive, Bruce Conn, says using the cladding shouldn't cause any problems by itself if fire protection measures are in place.
It's one of those questions to look at what lessons can be learned from the London fire. I think at this stage the track record of New Zealand buildings has been very, very good, and therefore I would see no reason out here not to use it.
Andrew Bruce says New Zealand has a very strict building code, and he says the chance of a similar disaster happening in New Zealand is small.
We live in a 14-storey apartment block, and that's the first thing that went through my mind as well. But then I automatically went to, well, look, there are these safeguards in place to try and avoid this vast spread of fire, which just looked absolutely horrific and very, very scary for anyone involved.
Andrew Bruce says apartment tenants should contact their property manager if they have any concerns. For Checkpoint, call Logan Church Tanay.
Coming up, what are our preschoolers eating? Claims that some early childhood centres are serving mouldy bread and providing cake 3 times a day. And a woman racially abused at Christchurch's Shirley Rugby Club finally receives an apology. Don't forget you can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint with John Campbell, or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. And you can watch us online on Facebook Live at rnz.co.nz/checkpoint, on Freeview Channel 50 and on Face TV Sky Channel 83. Well, a scathing new report has found New Zealand has the highest rate of youth suicide in the developed world, and other figures show young people in this country continue to suffer. The UNICEF report looked at 41 countries in the European Union and the OECD. Eric Frickbird reports.
The UNICEF report looked at children's well-being in several ways and didn't like what it saw. And the figure it liked least was the rate of suicide among 15 to 19-year-olds. UNICEF New Zealand's National Advocacy Manager, Prudence Stone, says it's appalling.
New Zealand has the worst adolescent suicide rate in the world, 15.6 children per 100,000.
That number is significantly higher than the next worst country, Lithuania. It's also twice the American youth suicide rate, 5 times the British rate, and 8 times worse than the best-performing countries, Italy and Portugal. The chief executive of the Mental Health Foundation, Sean Robinson, is furious.
It makes me angry and it makes me very sad and frustrated because this is an avoidable situation, but sadly it's been the reality for far too long and we're simply not getting to grips with preventing suicides amongst our young people.
Sue Bradshaw is an academic and medical practitioner who works with many vulnerable young people, and she says the problem of suicide has many causes, many of them economic.
One of the biggest ones I see is the marginalisation of young people in terms of casual labour, low wages, no jobs. There's a big factor in terms of our high rates of child abuse. All of those things lead to a lack of hope.
Ines Asher is a professor of paediatrics at the University of Auckland and a campaigner at the Child Poverty Action Group. She says the UNICEF report is a terrible indictment, and she says the problem of youth suicide can be reduced.
A lot of those young people who commit suicide will have been depressed. If you're depressed, you need to see a doctor, your GP. Teenagers have to pay to go to the doctor between ages of 13 and 17. It's a no-brainer that if we wanted to do something about the youth suicide rate in New Zealand, we've got to have free GP visits for teenagers in this country.
Sean Robinson also has clear ideas about how the teenage suicide problem can be lessened.
We can provide immediate crisis support. There are ways that we can have emergency response teams when we start seeing clusters of suicides occurring. We can build much more resilience and well-being and mental health awareness into schools and, start actively working to make that happen.
The UNICEF report covers other issues as well, such as teenage pregnancy. Although New Zealand has reduced this problem in the last 12 years, it's still the 6th worst of the 41 developed countries included in this survey and trails Britain, Australia and Canada. The country does better in some criteria, such as pollution levels, but fails to make the grade in others, such as being the 7th worst offender out of the 41 for the rate of murders of people aged 0 to 19. For Checkpoint, Eric Frickberg.
An Auckland teacher says some early childhood centres are serving mouldy bread, ignoring halal rules and providing cake 3 times a day. The allegations follow University of Auckland research which found most menus at early childhood centres do not meet Health Ministry nutrition guidelines, with half regularly including unhealthy food. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen filed this report.
The children at Little Wonders Wellington Early Childhood Centre are pretty good when it comes to choosing food.
Sandwiches, cucumber and tuna, meatballs, fruit and pineapple.
Does anyone here like cake or chips?
I like cake.
But do you think you should eat it every day or maybe just sometimes?
Sometimes. Because there's sugar in it and it's not good for us.
The centre manager, Sarah Jimmerson, says a nutritionist helps develop its menus, which are based on whole foods.
Parents are really happy because they know that when their child's here, they're getting a well-balanced meal and they don't have to worry so much if they're rushing home from work at night time to serve dinner and things like that. They know that they've been fed well during the day.
But University of Auckland research published today says most centres do not have such high standards, with just 3 of 57 menus getting maximum marks for nutrition. It says half the menus included things like cake and chips, which should only be served on special occasions. Auckland teacher Susan Bates says she's not surprised by the study's findings.
The quality is terrible. There's a lot of junk food being given out. The worst thing for me, I think, is that menus are put up for parents and they look at it and think it's all fine, but that's not what's being actually served to the children. And there are other issues like halal rules not being followed and things like that.
She's been surveying early childhood teachers since 2013 and says problems with food are commonplace.
I have been into more than 40 centres and come up with a number of concerns around food and had a lot of stuff from other teachers. This is something that is a common complaint that I get from teachers, so I think it is probably pretty widespread.
Susan Bates says Health Ministry and Heart Foundation guidelines are not enough and government agencies should be monitoring what early childhood services are serving up. But the Chief Executive of the Early Childhood Council, Peter Reynolds, says there's no need for tighter policing.
No, I don't believe so. I mean, recently there was also some research that came out that pointed to the fact that young preschool children are on average losing weight compared with where they were a few years ago. Now that would tend to indicate that actually we're doing some things that are pretty good.
The Education Minister, Nikki Kay, says a report based on Education Review Office visits in 2016 showed 9 out of 10 services were doing well or very well at promoting positive attitudes to food, nutrition and physical activity. For Checkpoint, John Gerritsen.
Tonight on
And coming up, 3 men have been found guilty in one of the country's biggest ever cases of Pokey machine fraud. And a shooting during a charity baseball game practice leaves the 3rd-ranked Republican in the US House of Representatives in a critical condition. But first, here's Katrina Batten with the headlines.
The Mental Health Foundation wants targets for reducing the number of deaths from suicide like those for cutting the road toll. It follows a scathing new report that says New Zealand has the highest rate of youth suicide in the developed world, almost 5 times that of Britain. The New Zealand First Leader has criticised the Race Relations Commissioner for trying to tell him and other politicians how to handle racism. Dame Susan Devoy is urging politicians not to play the race card during this year's election campaign. But Winston Peters says when someone racially slurred him in January, Dame Susan's office didn't want to know about it. The Finance Minister, Stephen Joyce, says while the latest OECD assessment of the economy is useful, it won't make the government change its approach. In its latest 2-yearly review, the Paris-based organisation says New Zealand's economy is growing robustly, but the government could do more to lift low incomes. It also warns this country's low productivity risks the stunting of living standards. Stephen Joyce says the government is working on raising productivity, but it's not a quick fix. A Brazilian woman has been jailed for 8 years for trying to smuggle nearly 5 kilograms of cocaine in her luggage. 29-year-old Evelyn Stemposki arrived in Auckland from Brazil via Chile in April. Customs says the drugs were found in false bottoms of both her suitcases with a potential street value of up to $3.2 million. Stemposki was sentenced today in the Manukau District Court. A fire safety expert says New Zealand high-rise apartments are quite safe compared to the London apartment block that caught fire yesterday while its residents slept. Fire safety engineer Michael James says the London fire was likely worsened by the building having no working smoke alarms, a lack of smoke ventilation and no sprinklers. The fire killed 12 people and almost 80 people are being treated in hospital. Mr James says any building of that size here would have to have a working sprinkler system and other safety measures. Those are the headlines. I'll be back at 6.
Well, economic growth figures released today have disappointed many, and our economics correspondent Patrick O'Mara joins us now. He's been looking at the March quarter GDP figures.
Well, hi Rowan. Yes, well the market had expected 0.7%, but it came through at 0.5%. That followed 0.4%, so we've had 2 quarters in a row of rather subpar growth. Now, agriculture did bounce back this time after a slow start to the season last year, but construction activity, that fell. It contracted for the first time in almost 2 years. Now, that fall in construction we think is a timing issue. Basically, there was a lot of industrial and commercial projects which are finished at the end of last year, which bolstered that number in comparison. But David Kelly, he's the chairman of the Construction Industry Council. He says the industry has got plenty of work on and that demand for housing and building premises is still pretty strong. But he does warn that the cost of land in Auckland is holding up activity.
There are some issues in the Auckland market. If I compare it to the regions where previously it was a bit quiet, they're really going gangbusters in most places. Christchurch, of course, coming off the peak. But Auckland, the challenge is around land price. And In terms of building at scale for residential development, a number of the larger builders are just saying they're a bit cautious because they've got to be careful about how much risk they take on.
Now, Rowan, for the year we saw growth of around 3%. Look, that's pretty solid, but once you factor in the population growth that we've seen, look, the gains are pretty thin, they're very mediocre. Look, there's still plenty of people out there who still think this is going to be a fairly solid economy, and some very good reasons for thinking that. Dairy prices are on the up. In fact, agriculture as a whole is on the up. You've got that population growth. Household spending has held up. Business investment rose to its highest level in 7 years. So, look, very strong reasons for a good economy looking ahead. Look, we should probably also point out that in the OECD stakes, New Zealand stands out ahead of countries such as Australia, the US, Canada and Britain.
Yeah, so that's saying that New Zealand has actually done pretty well, but there's still a bit of room for improvement. Is that right?
Yeah, there certainly is. And this is where this OECD report has kind of highlighted bouquets for the economy, but brickbats really for productivity. Look, in fact, the CTU calculated that they think productivity, just in that March year we just saw, actually fell back 1.3%. And New Zealand has been a serial offender in this area. Now, the OECD, it's got a number of recommendations that it thinks will fix that. It's always got a lot of recommendations. Cutting company tax is one of them, reducing barriers to foreign investment, giving councils more latitude to build infrastructure that they need to support the housing supply that's required. For example, they think that some of the GST could go to them. As we heard, though, from Stephen Joyce, really, that's not his bag at all. Governments tend to ignore the OECD recommendations. He's no different. But look, the OECD's chief economist, Catherine Mann, who is also in the country, she points out that many New Zealanders are overqualified for the jobs that they have, and that also is hampering productivity.
What we have found is that many people who have the high technology skills, in fact, don't use them in their jobs. So there's a mismatch between what the skills they have and the skills that they use. And if we could get a better match between jobs and skills, the productivity growth in New Zealand could be about 2.25 percentage points higher.
What she means by that, Rowan, is that means more money for those people. And of course, Rowan, are we overqualified for our jobs? Well, I'll let you judge that one.
Not for the one I'm doing today, Patrick. Now, what's been happening in the markets?
Look, very strong day on the markets, up 0.4% or 32 points at 7,516. Look, it's creeping up close to those highs that we saw in early September last year. The New Zealand dollar, look, a touch weaker after those GDP numbers. It was down about 0.5% against the US dollar at 72.2 US, and against the Australian, down about 1 cent to 94.9.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Well, the nurse who wrote the first mental health assessment on Akshay Chand for court says he told her he was no risk to his victim and she took him at his word. Forensic nurse Alan Wilson told the coroner's inquest into the death of 18-year-old Christy Marceau that she only had 20 minutes to meet with Chand in the cells at North Shore District Court. Ms Wilson said she took a further 30 minutes to write the report, but by the time she had finished, Chand had already appeared in court. Our Auckland court reporter Edward Gay filed this report.
Despite Ms Wilson's report not being viewed by the judge on the day, it did go into the court file and was one of the documents before Judge McNaughton when he granted Chand bail less than 4 weeks later. A month after Chand was released, he made the 2-minute walk to the Marceau family home and stabbed Christy Marceau to death. Ms Wilson said her report was just an initial screening process and she didn't have access to complete medical records or court documents.
It felt incomplete to me. It felt rushed, and because it felt rushed, it felt incomplete. I felt like I could have written more.
Ms Wilson said in hindsight that should have been communicated to the judge. She said Chand was happy to talk about himself, but not the victim or the charges he was facing. Dr Ian Goodwin was asked by the court to assess whether Chand was mentally fit to stand trial and interviewed him for 1 hour and 16 minutes inside Mount Eden Prison.
I noted that Mr Chand had a good understanding of the charges he was facing
He was able to give me a clear and articulate account of his version of events. I formed the opinion that Mr. Chand would likely be found fit.
Dr Goodwin said he wasn't aware his report was to be used to assess Chand for bail, and that was not its purpose.
Had the court or counsel requested a risk assessment with regard to the possibility of bail, I would have done so. I would note that such a request would be unusual and outside the usual parameters for ordering Section 38 reports.
Later, the doctor said he's only ever been asked by the court to prepare a report for bail on 2 occasions in the last 20 years. He said he also pressed Chand hard on whether he was a risk to Miss Marceau.
Mr. Chand was extremely remorseful and able to give specific assurances to me about the safety of Ms. Marceau. Based on his previous lack of violent offending or apparent dishonesty, combined with the consistent collateral history available, there was no reason to disbelieve his assurances at that time.
Dr Goodwin said 6 years on from writing the report, he still believed it was robust and comprehensive. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi ko Edward Gayahau.
The New Zealand First Leader has lashed out at the Race Relations Commissioner for having the audacity to tell politicians not to stoop to race lows in this year's election campaign. Winston Peters says he was racially abused at Ratanapa in January and her office didn't want to know about it. Here's our political reporter Demelza Leslie.
The Race Relations Commissioner Dame Susan Devoy is urging politicians not to play the race card during this year's election campaign. It follows today's launch of a campaign warning that racial intolerance and overt attacks are on the rise. It's fronted by actor and director Taika Waititi.
As New Zealander of the Year, I'm calling on every one of my fellow Kiwis to help support a very important cause. Racism needs your help to survive.
Dame Susan says many population groups are being targeted, from Fijian to Chinese and Muslim.
What I'm asking people, and particularly asking politicians as we lead up to the election, that do not bring the race card into this. You know, let's debate the issues, let's use facts and figures and not hysterical hyperbole, and do not demonise all the immigrants that have come to live in this country and blame them for all the woes that are happening.
But the New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters says he's not interested in what Dame Susan has to say on the matter.
Look, earlier in the year, another pretend politician called me a house nigger. She did nothing about that, nor did her office. So frankly, I'm not interested in what Susan Devoy's got to say on these matters.
Mr Peters doesn't think racism will be part of this year's election campaign.
If the office thinks that they can supplement common sense and plain speaking and accuse that of being racist, then they're in for a big surprise in this campaign. And that's what I think that this office is trying to do. I'm surprised that she would actually make that comment. What on earth gives her the cause to say what she's saying? And frankly, you know, we're not going to stand by whilst a paid official gets it all wrong.
It's not the first time the pair have clashed. In April, Dame Susan said Winston Peters needed to focus on what is relevant after the New Zealand First Leader raised questions about work visa analysis carried out by 2 New Zealand Herald reporters. Mr Peters labelled the Herald's findings rubbish and highlighted the Asian ethnicity of the journalists involved. The Labour Party's campaign manager, Phil Twyford, says he agrees with Dame Susan's stance on the race card. He says he was rightly slammed when he singled out Chinese buyers in the Auckland housing market a couple of years ago.
And we learned a lot from that episode and recognised that, you know, while it was a genuine attempt to raise the issue of foreign investment in the housing market, it left many Chinese New Zealanders feeling really got at.
Mr Twyford says politicians shouldn't play the race card whether it's an election campaign or not. The National Party's campaign chair, Stephen Joyce, says it's very easy for groups to be targeted for perceived political gain.
If you end up scapegoating a group, I just think that ends up a bit destructive, obviously, to that group, but it probably says a little bit about your politics as well.
Dame Susan Devoy says everyone has a responsibility to speak up against racism. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Demelza Leslie.
Meanwhile, the woman who says she was called an effing black bee by a Shirley Rugby club coach has finally received an apology. Fiona Ireton was about to watch her grandson play rugby on May the 20th when a heated exchange erupted in the car park with a Shirley Rugby Club coach. Mrs Ireton says the coach racially abused her, but when she complained to the club, it said it wouldn't take action because the incident took place in the car park and not on the sideline. But the Canterbury Rugby Union thought differently and held a judicial inquiry, and 3 weeks later the coach has apologised for his bad behaviour.
For me, it felt like he was probably more worried about the club and everything else. That's what I read into it when I first read it. So, and then everything else upon that was secondary.
And no mention of
Anything.
racist assault in the apology there. Do you
just
accept
behaviour?
Yeah. Do you accept that he's genuinely sorry, given that he hasn't mentioned anything about the racial abuse?
Oh, there's Christchurch is full of ballheads, and so, he's just another one of them. I guess maybe after our meeting on Tuesday, he might have been a bit more apologetic, and he did want to have a say to me, in person by myself, but doesn't really mean anything now.
So you just had a meeting this Tuesday with him,
Yep.
did you?
With the judiciary.
And how did that go?
For me, the Canterbury Rugby Union, once they got on board, actually listened and took this all really seriously. I guess for me, my contention has always been is him for the initial what he said, but then how the club reacted towards it and how they treated me through that process. They seem to be actually more interested in their 100-year-old centenary that they were having. And so any other thing was sort of put by the by.
Have you experienced this kind of racism before in Canterbury in sport or rugby?
Not in league. And this is our first space within rugby. I have heard stories about lots of issues around clubs being called and teams being called all sorts of things. But again, it's just stuff you hear. But there's racism in New Zealand. I've grown up in a world where you couldn't get jobs because you were the wrong colour, and you couldn't get housing and rental properties because you were the wrong colour, and so it became it's a norm for a lot of people. What were your first thoughts when you heard those words directed at you? I was angry. I'm just sick of it. Here we go, another baldy, and I went out and wanted to find out what was going on and had words with him, obviously, as you do, and then it just got silly, and he was just angry and all the rest of it. But that is what it is. He is what he is. He's probably never going to change, and he's in his wee bubble, and that's fine. But if we can at least get our younger children, like my daughter's age and younger, not accepting it, and I guess 54, I'm not happy with it, but I'm also very compliant. We've been taught to be compliant within our race. Growing up, we weren't allowed. There was no Māori or anything taught in our schools. If you spoke anything like that, it was smacked out of you with rulers and things like that with teachers. So for me to see what I have endured and how the teaching and everything it's changed markedly. And I mean, with issues like this new campaign that's going out, Give Nothing to Racism, it's going to improve more so. So hopefully when my grandchildren come along into the wide world of work and employment and things like that, looking for housing, there won't be any problem.
And just finally, Fiona, is the Canterbury Rugby Union doing enough to combat racism? I mean, as you said, we've heard a lot of stories over the years of racist assaults being thrown at players and spectators.
Yeah.
Has the union done enough?
I think they're working towards They're working towards it. I mean, it's something that you can't just fix overnight. This is learned behaviour. This is it's intergenerational behaviour. So the rugby union have got this new chairman now, and he's got this campaign going. I felt when I went to our judiciary that they were listening to us. They were actually acknowledging my daughter and listening to her too. And so I guess it's small steps. What I'd like to see is more understanding for people on grassroots like the nannies and the cousins and whoever else are going to watch their children play, that if they hear that, they know what to do, what the processes are to make it easier for them, so that it stops.
That was Fiona Ireton. A gunfight during a charity baseball game practice has left the third-ranked Republican in the US House of Representatives in a critical condition. Members of Congress have described the harrowing chain of events when the gunman opened fire on them before being shot by special agents. The FBI is now trying to establish the shooter's motive and is investigating the 66-year-old's anti-Trump social media posts. The ABC's Zoe Daniel reports.
Members of Congress were at an early morning baseball practice in suburban Alexandria just outside DC when they were attacked by a man with a high-powered weapon. Congressman Jack Bergman is a former US Marine who was suddenly under fire.
Standing by the batting cage when the first round rang out, everybody kind of listened, and then another one came following it shortly thereafter, and we knew it was real. Everybody just started to scramble.
Senators and House reps threw themselves into a dugout behind first base as shots rang out. Senator Jeff Flake.
It went on for about 10 minutes. Dozens and dozens and dozens of shots fired.
The group's security detail engaged the gunman who was shooting from the cover of the third base dugout.
2 of the Capitol Police were shot. One staffer who dove into the dugout with a leg wound, and we got somebody's belt and put it around there to stop the bleeding.
Congressman Mo Brooks described it as pandemonium.
There were some congressmen on phones screaming for reinforcements.
Early on, Majority House Whip Steve Scalise was hit.
Once we got the all clear that the shooter was down, we ran out to second base for Steve Scalise. He had crawled into the outfield, leaving a trail of blood.
Neighbour John Patrick told me he saw a helicopter land on the field opposite his home, apparently picking up the wounded congressman who's since had surgery and should recover.
I look over and they're tending to a body in the outfield. They put the body on a stretcher, and then the helicopter came and took him away.
The FBI has taken over the investigation and is looking for a motive. The gunman's been identified as 66-year-old James T. Hodgkinson from Illinois. Authorities are looking at his anti-Trump social media posts. Republican Jeff Duncan says he spoke to the shooter shortly before the attack.
I did have an interaction with someone in the parking lot who asked me if the team practicing was a Democrat or Republican team. I told him they were Republicans.
Democrat Bernie Sanders has condemned what happened after discovering that the perpetrator was a volunteer on his presidential campaign last year.
I condemn this action in the strongest possible terms.
The President has thanked the special agents who may well have averted mass fatalities. 2 special agents and 2 congressional aides remain in hospital, along with Congressman Scalise, who's in a critical condition.
That was Zoe Daniel reporting from Washington there. Well, 3 men have been found guilty in one of the country's biggest ever cases of Pokey machine fraud. Michael O'Brien, Paul Max and Kevin Coffey faced a raft of charges relating to Pokey licences granted by the Department of Internal Affairs, including fraudulently obtaining gaming licences. Paloma Magoni filed this report from the High Court in Wellington.
After having his own company's Pokey licence revoked in 2005, Michael O'Brien dishonestly obtained licences by getting others to set up companies to apply for them on his behalf. The Marlboro Racing personality then managed the returns through a company he set up, Bluegrass Holdings, for his own purposes. This included a scheme with racing groups where O'Brien would lobby for them to receive grants from the Pokey machine's proceeds in exchange for kickbacks. Between 2009 and 2013, Bluegrass Holdings paid out nearly $12 million in grants. The 3 men stood silently in the dock as the verdicts were delivered by Justice Dobson.
Michael O'Brien, I find you guilty on charges 11, 12 and 13 to 15 inclusive of the charges you faced. Kevin Coffey, I find you guilty on charge 11 and not guilty on charge 12. Paul Max, I find you guilty on charges 13, 14 and 15.
O'Brien was found guilty on all 5 charges, 3 relating to fraudulently obtaining licenses, 1 of mismanaging proceeds, and another of lying to Internal Affairs. Paul Max was found guilty of 3 charges of dishonestly obtaining gambling licenses. A former Department of Internal Affairs employee, Kevin Coffey, was found guilty of one charge of lying to the department, but not guilty of controlling the proceeds on Bluegrass Holdings' behalf. O'Brien's lawyer, Bruce Squire, asked that his client be released on bail pending sentencing.
He is married with 2 young children, but his wife is she is Indonesian, and she's presently in Indonesia with a family member who is having significant health difficulties. So he is at the moment the sole carer of his 2 children.
But Justice Dobson refused the request and remanded all 3 men in custody until sentencing, which will be on July the 13th. O'Brien's father, Patrick O'Brien, a former New Zealand harness racing chairman, was originally facing charges but was removed from the trial in its early stages due to serious ill health. For Checkpoint, Paloma Migone.
A flotilla has blocked ships from leaving the Tauranga port today in protest at what the iwi organisers are calling a secret treaty deal. Members of the Tauranga iwi, Ngai Te Rangi, say they're shocked to learn the Crown has agreed to give the Hauraki collective some control in Tauranga as part of their treaty settlement. But as Te Manu Kōrehi reporter Shannon Honui-Thompson reports, the government denies there's any secret deal and says the protest is an insult to Māoridom.
7 boats, including a carved wakataua and more than 40 passengers, were out on the Tauranga harbour blocking commercial ships from leaving the port. A protest designed to send a message to the government about whose waka was first to paddle the waters of Tauranga. Charlie Tawhiao, the chair of the Ngai Te Rangi Iwi board, says they want Hauraki iwi and hapu to receive a just and fair treaty settlement, but aren't happy if it impedes on Tauranga iwi rights.
What we believe is the Crown is going to include in that settlement for Hauraki redress that provides Hauraki iwi with status within Tauranga Moana that is not based or that is just not justifiable.
Mr Tawhiao says there's no justification for the Crown to give rights within the Tauranga Moana to the Hauraki collective, and the only way this can be sorted out is by an iwi to iwi hui.
Allow us as Tauranga Moana iwi to have the conversation with Hauraki iwi that needs to be had a iwi, a mana, a kanohi, so that we can address this issue as in the way that our tipuna did.
Paul Majuri of the Hauraki collective says this wasn't a secret deal, and iwi of Tauranga Moana have known about the deal since 2014.
All of the Tauranga Moana iwi were involved in that, and in fact they agreed to that redress. So what appears to have occurred is that some of the current leadership and folk involved don't like what's happened previously, and that is surprising given their close involvement with it. The other key fact in this is that the customary interests of Pari Hauraki within Tauranga Moana have been recognised by the Waitangi Tribunal in their reports.
The Treaty Negotiations Minister, Chris Finlayson, is disappointed to hear of the protest and had strong words for Ngai Te Rangi.
I thought I was reading something akin to Alice in Wonderland. There is no secret agreement at all. I think this is probably a pre-planned stunt, and I'm deeply unimpressed, and I think they're insulting Māoridom.
Mr Finlayson says lots of work goes into settling claims involving multiple tribes, and he's asked the iwi leaders for him to help him develop a cross-claims process if they aren't happy with the current arrangements.
I have been trying to deal with overlapping claims with these people for some time, and Charlie Tawhiao knows that full well.
But Ngai Te Rangi is undeterred. It's planning a long-term protest and is setting up base camp at Manus Island. Further action is planned this weekend. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Shannon Honui-Thompson, aho.
A French pilot has successfully crossed the English Channel in a flying car that looks part dune buggy, part paraglider. Under a clear blue sky, Bruno Vizzoli launched his flying machine down an abandoned wartime runway near Calais, lurching from side to side as he slowly gained altitude, suspended beneath a giant canopy. Bozzoli landed safely 59 kilometres away near the English port town of Dover 50 minutes after taking off. Named Pegasus, a winged horse in Greek mythology, the flying car is the brainchild of Jerome Dorphy, an entrepreneur inspired by early aviators who made the first flight across the Channel in 1909. Pegasus can reach a maximum speed of 80 kilometres an hour and an altitude of 3,000 metres with an autonomy of 3 hours. Dorphy's initial ambition had been to build a flying machine that could travel round the world in 80 days. And after 6 tonight, we return to London, where the death toll's expected to rise in the coming hours following yesterday's fire which engulfed the Grenfell Tower apartment block. We speak to UNICEF about its scathing new report, which has found New Zealand has the highest rate of youth suicide and ranks us 34th out of 41 countries in the OECD and European Union. And please send us your feedback. You can text us on 2101 or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or Facebook us Checkpoint with John Campbell. Here's Katrina with the news.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui, good evening, ko Katrina Batanaho. The Mental Health Foundation is angry that New Zealand's youth suicide rate tops the developed world in a new report from UNICEF. It says New Zealand has to lift its game to combat youth suicide. The report looked at 41 countries in the European Union and the OECD. It found New Zealand's rate of 15.6 per 100,000 people aged 15 to 19 was twice as bad as America's and almost 5 times Britain's. The Foundation's Chief Executive, Sean Robinson, is angry about this and wants New Zealand to get a grip with the problem once and for all.
One of our big criticisms of the new government suicide prevention strategy was that it has no targets. And if we set a target, then we will put the kinds of actions into place to achieve that. We've done that with the road toll, and we can do that with suicide.
Sean Robinson of the Mental Health Foundation. Many people remain unaccounted for following the huge fire that engulfed a London tower block. 12 people are known to have died, but that toll is expected to rise significantly in coming days, with many people unaccounted for. 34 people remain in hospital, 18 critical. Sarah Corker was at Grenfell House Tower as dawn broke in West London.
We saw some firefighters on top of a crane and they were shining lights floor by floor into this building. Some flats are still on fire more than 24 hours on. We've been outside an evacuation centre over the last couple of hours and we saw cars lining up queuing to deliver goods. There was everything from food, water, toys, bedding. There was even a pile of prams there, and this is coming from all corners of this very diverse community.
Sarah Corker in Kensington. A fire safety engineer says a calamity like the Grenfell Tower is unlikely here, given the government's strict regulations. Michael James says the London blaze was likely worsened by having no sprinklers and no working smoke alarms and a lack of smoke ventilation. Mr James says high-rise apartment blocks here are quite safe.
We probably wouldn't get all of those things together. Typically in New Zealand we would have a sprinkler system in a building of that size. I don't think that I can recall any of that size that wouldn't have a sprinkler system in. The alarm system wasn't working throughout the building, so people weren't aware that the building was on fire. You know, that shouldn't really happen in a building.
Fire safety engineer Michael James. The New Zealand First Leader has criticised the Race Relations Commissioner for trying to tell him and other politicians how to handle racism. Dame Susan Devoy is urging politicians not to play the race card during this year's election campaign following the launch of a new anti-racism campaign. Winston Peters says when he was racially slurred by someone at Ratana Pa in January, Dame Susan's office didn't want to know about it. However, he says he doesn't think racism will be part of the election campaign. The government is brushing off a fall in construction activity in the first 3 months of the year. The economy grew a modest 0.5% in the March quarter as a fall in building work weighed on a strong rebound in dairy prices. Construction fell 2.1%, the first contraction in almost 2 years. The Finance Minister, Stephen Joyce, says despite the decline, construction rose by 9% for the year and New Zealand is still in one of the biggest building booms the country has ever seen. An Auckland teacher says some early childhood centres are serving mouldy bread, ignoring halal rules and providing cake 3 times a day. The allegations follow University of Auckland research that found most menus at early childhood centres do not meet Health Ministry nutrition guidelines. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen reports.
The research published today gave just 3 of 57 early childhood centre menus maximum marks for nutrition. It says half the menus included things like cake and chips, which should only be served on special occasions. Auckland teacher Susan Bates says she's not surprised by the study's findings because she often hears of problems from her colleagues. She says Health Ministry and Heart Foundation guidelines are not enough, and government agencies should be monitoring the food served by early childhood services a lot more closely. This is John Gerritsen.
A 29-year-old Brazilian woman has been jailed for 8 years for trying to smuggle nearly 5 kilograms of cocaine in her luggage. Evelyn Stimposki arrived at Auckland Airport on a flight from Brazil via Chile in April. Customs says it identified her as a high-risk passenger while she was on her way to New Zealand. The drugs found in false bottoms in both her suitcases had a potential street value of up to $3.2 million. Customs says while the woman had created an elaborate cover-up story, its officers are trained to be suspicious and the x-rays revealed she was hiding something. She was sentenced today in the Manukau District Court. Fonterra has pulled some of its milk off shelves in the lower North Island after receiving complaints about it having an unpleasant flavour. It's issued a voluntary recall of several batches of Anchor dark blue top milk, but insists it is safe to consume. Fonterra is now investigating what has caused the change in taste. Foodstuffs says the milk may have been affected by the feed given to cows. It says customers who've already purchased the affected milk are welcome to return to their local store for a refund. It's almost 6:06. In sport, the Māori All Blacks coach Colin Cooper says Damien McKenzie has been given a licence to thrill in this weekend's clash with the British and Irish Lions as the Māori seek to break down the Lions' rush defence. McKenzie has spent most of his Chiefs career at fullback, but it's understood the All Black selectors believe his long-term future is at number 10. Cooper is expecting a flat bordering on offside defence from the Lions, and he's hoping that McKenzie at first 5 will help them breach the Lions' armour.
More the style we want to play and the threat he offers with his kicking game, particularly against the Lions will bring a lot of line speed, so to utilise his speed and ability and that space there.
Colin Cooper. Meanwhile, the Lions coach Warren Gatland says he wants to keep the All Blacks guessing after naming what doesn't appear to be his top side for the Māori game. Gatland has named an entirely different starting 15 from the team that lost to the Highlanders. He's gone with the loose trio that started against the Crusaders, meaning tour captain Sam Warburton is on the bench. First choice, first 5, Owen Farrell is also in the reserves. Team New Zealand has its favourite wing back on the boat after a week-long repair following its capsize at the America's Cup in Bermuda. The opening America's Cup races against holder Oracle start on Sunday morning. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Tristan Donovan presents a brief history of the origins of Monopoly, the board game that was supposed to put us off becoming property tycoons. Not sure that worked. Our Changing World investigates some amber fossils and how they're changing our understanding of our prehistoric world. And this week's cultural ambassador Chris Janidis celebrates the 40th birthday of the Limbs Dance Company on Nights from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow, Northland to Manawatu, including Coromandel and the central high country, mostly cloudy with isolated showers in the west. Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mainly fine but isolated showers about coastal Gisborne and the Mahia Peninsula later tomorrow. Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast, Wellington, Wairarapa, Nelson and Marlborough, fine with high cloud. Bulla and Westland, rain spreading north this evening, followed by a few showers. Showers clearing tomorrow and fine spells in increasing. Fiordland, rain clearing this evening, cloudy periods and a few showers tomorrow. Canterbury, cloud increasing this evening and the odd shower developing, becoming fine tomorrow morning. Otago and Southland, a period of evening rain followed by a few coastal showers, mainly about Stewart Island, and occasional showers for the Chatham Islands. It's 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina. Well, firefighters remain at the smouldering Grenfell Tower block in West London as they continue what they describe as a complex recovery operation. 12 people have been confirmed dead after yesterday's massive blaze in the 24-storey tower block in North Kensington, but the death toll is expected to rise. Harrowing tales of escape have emerged as fire crews move from floor to floor looking for more victims. The BBC's Mark Easton looks at how the disaster unfolded and the immediate aftermath.
The fire started between midnight and 1, the screams from the flats and the acrid smell of burning, waking neighbours.
It was just, people jumping out literally and putting sheets down to try and get out of the building. Windows exploding, big, massive pieces of debris falling to the floor.
We came here to see people jumping off, people calling.
You saw people jumping off?
Yeah, people have jumped off because they had no other option to.
How high up?
The top floor.
Saw someone jump and someone was on fire and they jumped too, and he didn't make it.
So people have picked up their kids and thrown them out for the police to pick them up because there was no other way out the building.
I saw kids standing at the window screaming, help me, I can't breathe, help me.
Oh, look, man. The fire raced through the 24-storey council block in this deprived part of North Kensington. On the 7th floor, this family were led to safety when a fire officer made it up to their flat.
And the smoke everywhere, people screaming, the other neighbours were coming out. There was a fireman there going, get out, get out. So I ran back in, I'm just in my boxer shorts, I put my dressing gown on, I've grabbed a little girl, put her under my dressing gown to cover her face from the smoke, got my girlfriend up, ran down the stairs, we're on the 7th, as we're running down, we've gone to the 4th floor and it's pitch black.
With dawn came grim, if expected, news that lives had been lost.
I'm looking for my brother.
Was he in the flat at the time?
Yeah.
So you don't know whether he's okay?
Is he in here? Are you going back?
Many people, numb with shock, frantically searched to find missing friends and relatives. This woman's sister and 12-year-old nephew were unaccounted for.
My sister with her son, yeah.
How old was he?
He's 12 years old. His name is Brooke. That's why I asked her, his missus.
What floor are you on? Huh? 7, yeah?
Well into the morning, the crowds watching the horror unfold in front of them reported seeing people still trapped in the block.
I saw somebody there in a white...
in a white shirt?
Yeah, white shirt, yeah.
A man was eventually brought out by the emergency services at noon. This off-duty nurse helped tend to some of the injured rescued from the building.
I've seen some things, but today I can't even describe it. There's mothers that have come out and lost their children. There are firefighters that have come out injured that we don't know if they're going to even come out safe. People have lost their homes, children have seen things, people were jumping out the window. We just need to rebuild as a community now.
This is a neighbourhood that feels ignored. There's anger on the streets. London's mayor promised there would be a thorough and independent investigation into what had happened.
My thoughts and prayers, as I'm sure the thoughts and prayers of the entire country, are with the family and friends of those in the building unaffected by this tragic and horrific fire. Also make tribute to the amazing emergency services from the fire service. We have more than 250 firefighters, many of whom have been here from the beginning.
The streets of North Kensington are littered with ashes, the charred homework of a school child blown from Grenfell Tower. But the neighbourhood is also scarred by grief that will not pass for a long, long time.
That's Mark Easton reporting from West London. Well, people living in Grenfell Tower say they've warned for years that it was a fire risk and a disaster waiting to happen. A blog written by the Grenfell Action community group last year claimed only a catastrophic event would expose the unacceptable risks to residents. The BBC's Tom Simons has more.
In the mid-1990s, the running of Grenfell Tower was handed over to the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Association. In recent years, the association's been the subject of a stream of complaints from the tower's residents. In November, the Grenfell Action Group blogged that only an incident that results in serious loss of life would allow scrutiny of the way the building is managed. The group had a long list of concerns, according to its former chairman, David Collins.
We repeatedly reported concerns to the tenant management organisation of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, including fire safety concerns, which were not investigated during the regeneration works. Concerns over locations of boilers, concerns about escape, concerns about fire escape lighting, and the list goes on. 90% of residents signed an independent petition asking for there to be an investigation into the organisation that runs this building because they were so incompetent, and the council turned it down.
In 2015, there was a small fire at a daycare tower nearby, run by the same management association as Grenfell Tower. Afterwards, the London Fire Brigade issued an enforcement notice listing a string of failures in managing the risk of a fire there and the responses should one break out. The brigade also said both escape routes and emergency plans were inadequate. It was one of several times in recent years the Management Association had been told to improve fire safety. But the leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council, Nick Paget-Brown, insisted the issue had not been neglected.
There's always concerns about high-rise buildings and what the fire procedures are and what the fire regulations require. Blocks are regularly inspected. The organisation which runs the council's housing stock, the tenant management organisation, will commission regular inspections, and clearly there will need to be a thorough investigation as to what the cause of the fire was and why it appears to have spread so rapidly.
And that's the central question. The investigation is sure to look closely at whether the way fire safety was managed contributed to the speed with which this inferno took hold.
And that's Tom Simons in West London. Well, CNN's Phil Black is near the Grenfell Tower and joins us now live. Hello, Phil. Can you tell us what the scene's looking like now? Is that tower still smouldering?
It is, Rowan, yeah, but it is dramatically different to what we were seeing just 24 hours ago. It is really incredibly still now, where 24 hours ago we saw the flames leaping from the windows and that huge column of smoke climbing into the London sky. Today there is just a gentle smoke lifting off this charred black monolith, but that's where firefighters have been working through the night to ensure that, to get to the bottom really and to put out what remained of the smouldering fire.
And is there any information coming out as to what the cause may have been of this fire?
Not the cause, no, that's still the subject of an investigation, as is the way the fire behaved from that point. As you've been hearing, it just raced with incredible speed. In a way, I think that firefighters here simply, well, they admittedly were surprised by. They say they've never seen anything like this. Many experienced firefighters have been fighting fires in London for decades, so they haven't seen a fire behave as this one did yesterday, consuming the building, racing through so many floors so quickly.
And what are people saying on the ground there, Phil? Is that sort of shock starting to turn to anger at all?
Well, it started very quickly yesterday, so there's been a real mix of emotions over the last 24 hours. There is shock and trauma, grief and distress. But you're right, there is anger here too. People here believe that clearly something went wrong. And because some people have been complaining about their concerns regarding fire safety in this building for some years, there's a real sense among some of the residents, some of the people in this community, that their concerns have simply, well, they've been ignored. And now the result has been this tragedy. As I think you heard there, the local authorities insist that fire safety was taken seriously in this building, that it was given an enormous, expensive refurbishment quite recently, and they thought that those concerns had been addressed. Now, all of this has to be pulled apart through a thorough investigation.
Phil, has there been any change to that official number of fatalities?
No, still 12 as of yesterday, but with that caveat from the authorities that they very much expect that to rise further. The reason they expect that, I suspect, is because, well, there are still people that are unaccounted for. We haven't been given a formal number there, but that means that there are people who are living in that building who are enduring this terrible necessity of waiting for confirmation of what they probably fear, and that is that their missing loved ones are, in fact, now dead. And so it's going to be a slow, difficult process of actually moving through what remains of that building and recovering their bodies.
Thank you very much for that. That's CNN's Phil Black joining us there from London. Meanwhile, Abdul Rahman Sayed from the Al Manar Mosque near the Grenfell Tower is waiting anxiously for authorities to disclose the identities of the dead. He says many of his worshippers lived in the building and are still missing. He says the community is struggling to come to terms with what happened.
We had colleagues and people who worshipped at the mosque who lived there. So it was really still unbelievable. We're trying to come to terms with that because just the night before we were all together praying, celebrating the fasting month, and all of a sudden now they were not there with us anymore, or we don't know what happened exactly.
So you still don't know whether they've survived that fire?
Not yet. We're just waiting for the authorities really to disclose all the information and the identities of any fatalities and casualties.
Can you tell me what your mosque has been doing since the fire happened?
From the first moment we heard about it, the first thing we decided to do was to keep the mosque on fire, to just walk in to sleep, to rest, to relax, to wash. We've also asked for some donations, and we were inundated with donations from the public, which was really, to this minute, as I left the place now, still people were coming with their blankets, bedding, anything you can imagine that a person would need. It's been delivered to the mosque.
What were they saying? What state were they in?
Well, people were in shock, and some were also very sad and crying. Others were just like uncertain what to feel or say, simply because it just happened, unexpected. They didn't know anything about their loved ones, and people were just worried because no one was telling them any detailed information about the whereabouts of their loved ones, whether they survived or not. So there was a degree of shock and sadness on the face of people.
And what have people been saying in the community today?
Well, the community was really overwhelmingly supporting any way they can. It's been like the phone has been ringing in the centre almost every second. If I say it's not an exaggeration, it's every second that we've been receiving calls. Also people coming physically, taking time off from work to help in organising and assisting in any way they can, physically as well as materially. So the response from the community was really overwhelming, and it still continued to this minute.
And is there any, are people asking questions of how this could happen? Is there any anger out there yet?
Well, I think it's too early. People are still trying to absorb the shock. And B, I think the emergency services have also been really doing a wonderful job. The police, the fire brigades, the ambulance, they were all there really trying their best. In fact, just an hour ago, I had a meeting, a Christian faith leader who came to our office and agreed with us to kind of have a coordination of counselling service in the next couple of weeks, the next 2 weeks. And that should include catering for the people from the ambulance and the emergency services who have witnessed this, calamity. Obviously, there will be some kind of inquiries a bit later on when things settle down as to what caused all this, damage to property as well as to people's lives.
And that was Abdul Rahman Sayed from a mosque near the Grenfell Tower. Well, a scathing report by UNICEF is highly critical of the status of children in New Zealand. It places us 34th out of 41 countries in the OECD and European Union. New Zealand was ranked the worst of all the countries for suicide among 15 to 19-year-olds and 22nd of the 41 nations on ending poverty. Dr. Prudence Stone is UNICEF New Zealand's child rights advocate. I spoke to her a short time ago via Skype video and asked her if New Zealand should feel ashamed.
Frankly, no surprise to UNICEF. Advocates in the child advocacy space have been letting successive governments know they need a better strategic approach that prioritises children for some time.
And, you know, among some of those statistics, we're at the bottom of the table for child homicide. Neonatal mortality has barely changed in 10 years. We have very high teen suicide rates. I mean, amongst all those sort of terrible statistics, is there any that sort of stand out as the worst to you?
Well, I think that, I mean, what you're doing is you're painting a picture of a child that stands at the intersection of all of those measures. So it's not really about zeroing in on the worst stat or the best stat and going, hooray, we do well somewhere. What you've actually got to think of is the child that might be experiencing all of these indicators at once. A child that lives in a household where there's income poverty is also a child that's probably facing food insecurity, is also probably born into a home with a teenage mum or a teenage parent. The parents might not have a job in the household at all, and these are the indicators. So we can't just look at one in isolation, but look at the entire picture that it paints in terms of the human condition for that child in New Zealand.
And some of the measures in the report, New Zealand isn't mentioned because the government wasn't or didn't provide statistics to UNICEF. Why is that?
Good question. I mean, we're a high-income nation. We've got the means. We've got great researchers in New Zealand. We've got an information data infrastructure and a social investment unit. We've got the means to provide good data sets so that we can benchmark ourselves against other high-income nations, particularly for child obesity rates. That has been in the news. We know what those rates are, and they're terrible. And so I just shudder to think what kind of status we would have. Would our ranking be even lower if we provided more data sets?
That's Prudence Stone there from UNICEF. Yesterday, the Australian government reached a $70 million out-of-court settlement with more than 1,900 men detained at the country's regional processing centre on Manus Island. One of them is Kurdish journalist Behrouz Boukhani, who's been held at the centre for 4 years after fleeing persecution in Iran for contributing to a Kurdish magazine. Mr Boukhani and hundreds of others were detained after trying to reach Australia by boat and brought class action against the government for false imprisonment and for being held in conditions that caused them physical and psychological harm. I asked him what he thought of the settlement.
I think this compensation is a part of justice, but is not whole justice. Also, it is not enough money for 4 years suffering and cannot cover all of the suffering and torture that we have experienced.
What was the reaction of the detainees that you spoke to when they heard of that compensation being granted?
Yeah, actually most of the refugees are very happy because I explained to you that it is the first time that we could get a little bit justice, and most of the refugees are very happy, but they think that it is not enough money. But what can we do? Wait for get more details from the lawyers, and we will have meeting with them, and we will have meeting together, and on that time, on next few days or next week, we will make a decision that we are satisfied with the money or not.
How are conditions in the camp right now?
Yeah, the condition, at this moment, these people are broken. These people are broken after 4 years suffering, and the people, they lost a lot of things, and they only think about freedom. But at this moment, I think they are happy, but in other side are worried about future because we don't know when we will get freedom and where we will go.
And I understand that you want to come to New Zealand. You know, if you're not able to, is your future in Papua New Guinea?
You know, when they sent me to this island, I started to work, and still I am working. So on future, my working is my struggling, it's my fighting for get freedom in a safe place. On future, when they take us from here, and if they settle us by 14 PNG, I never sign and I never accept that. And I will try to get to New Zealand because, you know, I don't like to go to America. But I will keep writing and working. If they always, before I told this system on immigration that while I am in this island, while I am in this prison, I fight against you, and I will write and will tell the truth.
And that was Beiruz Bukhani speaking to me there from Manus Island. And that's Checkpoint for this evening. Thanks for joining us on your radio, your television, online, or however you chose to connect with us today. You can hear highlights in late edition at 10:15 this evening, or any of our stories tonight on rnz.co.nz/checkpoint. And for all the latest news, information, features, stories from Radio New Zealand. But from me, Rowan, Quinn, and the Checkpoint team, have a good night.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Mental Health Foundation wants action to lower the youth suicide rate, which UNICEF says is the highest in the developed world. Winston Peters says he was racially slurred at Ratanapa this year, but the Race Relations Commissioner's office ignored it. The death toll from the London apartment building fire is expected to soar, with many still missing and 18 critically ill. And the Building and Construction Minister says combustible claddings on this country's high-rise buildings have been restricted. Our next news and weather is at 7.
It's catch-up time in this week's New Horizons when we look back over some of the music which didn't make the playlist in the first half of the year, including John Bowden, Bob Dylan, and this atmospheric soundtrack from an Oscar-winning film.